listening to This Week in Germany Extra, the interview podcast which focuses on German culture and society. In this episode, I speak to Professor Robert Beachy, the author of a book called Gay Berlin, Birthplace of a Modern Identity. In this fascinating book, Robert writes about the development of a gay identity in Germany, especially in the years between 1890 and 1933.
They also, as you pointed out, would literally give tours to different sorts of psychiatrists, doctors, visiting celebrities in some cases, journalists, people who would come to Berlin already starting in the 1890s and would be given a tour of Berlin's gay nightlife. And so this business of, slumming was something that was already established and then also facilitated by the police starting even a little before 1900, which is really remarkable.
All that plus much more, including the invention of the word homosexuality and the very first studies into sexual science, coming up on this edition of This Week in Germany Extra. I started off in our interview by asking Robert to describe a little bit about his book, Gay Berlin, Birthplace of a Modern Identity.
Sure thing. Well, the time frame that it covers is roughly the last third of the 19th century, late 1800s, into the 20th century, through the 1920s, and then into the early 1930s. So it stops more or less with the Nazi seizure of power in 1933. And it's in part a survey, but it's also a study of how a community in Berlin helped to establish what I've described as a new modern sexual identity and sort of make claims for the rights of this sexual minority as it came to be defined by the beginning of the 20th century.
And what fascinated you about this particular time period? And this particular place as well? Why Germany and why this time?
My starting point was really realizing that this word homosexual was a neologism, a modern one, something that had only been coined recently, relatively recently, and it first appeared in a German language publication in 1869. And this was a pamphlet that was written and published in protest against the Prussian anti-sodomy statute, or the anti-gay law. And so the author of this pamphlet coined a new term to describe these people, the people he felt were being discriminated against by this law. And homosexual today is a word that everybody knows and understands, and it's an interesting way to think about how this new sense or idea about a sexual minority emerged and sort of developed starting in the late 19th century.
So who was the first outspoken gay person in Germany?
There was an intrepid German jurist or lawyer, and his name was Karl Heinrich Ulrichs. And he was originally from the state of Hanover. He studied in Berlin and also in a few other places. He had a short-lived career as a state bureaucrat, but he lost his position because of rumors about his homosexuality. And he responded to this by deciding that he needed to protest the Prussian anti-gay or anti-sodomy statute. So he actually started to write and publish pamphlets. He did it initially under a pseudonym, but then eventually, within a few years, he started to use his own name. So he literally outed himself in the 1860s. And he also invented a language and a whole set of characteristics to describe what he considered to be a special class of people. And again, these were homosexuals. He had his own term. It was Urning, and sometimes it's translated as Uranian in English. It's very archaic. It's hardly used anymore, but it was actually quite common in the late 19th and early 20th century, at least in a German context.
So your book talks in general terms about Germany, because as you said, Ulrichs wasn't from Berlin, but then it focuses a lot on the gay culture inside Berlin, and I was very surprised to read about this. So Was there a real widespread gay culture in Berlin before the Nazi period? As we know, the Nazis cracked down on homosexuals. And were the police tough on gays?
Well, that's, I suppose, relative. And I think you'd have to say that in the context of the late 19th and early 20th century, the police, especially in Berlin, were actually quite tolerant. And it was a kind of enlightened, self-interested tolerance. And it was based on a policy that was developed by a single police officer. His name was Merscheid Hulessem. And he quickly realized that it was going to be really difficult to enforce this anti-gay law. And so he decided that it would make more sense to allow, especially men, but also to some extent women, to congregate essentially in their own bars and pubs. And as long as they behaved themselves, he would not try to close these establishments or these venues. And this allowed a very vibrant network of different kinds of bars and organizations to grow up already in the 1890s. So by the 1920s, by the period of the Weimar Republic, this gay lesbian culture was extensive, and it sort of spread well beyond Berlin, but it was actually already very well established before 1914, before the First World War. And I think that's one of the things that's really surprising. I guess, and this is one of my arguments in the book, the police in Berlin, and especially the work of this single police officer in the late 19th century, played a tremendous role in creating a kind of framework in which these different kinds of bars and organizations, and then also cross-dressing balls, could freely operate as long as they followed certain rules and obeyed a certain decorum. And as a result, Berlin already by the very beginning of the 20th century, the very early 1900s, had what was already recognized throughout a lot of Europe as the most flamboyant and the most widespread, the largest gay subculture in Europe, pretty much.
Am I right in saying that the police attended some of these balls and even gave tours of the nightlife hotspots, let's say?
Yes, absolutely. They were almost always in attendance. So even if they were tolerant to some extent, they were also always paying very close attention to what was going on. And that was actually the real reason for the tolerance. They felt that they would have a better chance of keeping tabs on this subculture if they could also know more about it and always be able to monitor it. But in addition to that, they also, as you just pointed out, would literally give tours to different sorts of psychiatrists, doctors, visiting celebrities in some cases, journalists, sort of urban ethnographers. So there was literally a parade of people who would come to Berlin already starting in the 1890s and would be given a tour of Berlin's gay nightlife. And so this business of, I guess, slumming was something that was already established and then also facilitated by the police starting even a little before 1900, which is really remarkable.
And Germany was also the center of research into sexual behavior around this time, right?
That's right. And it's this police policy, again, that I think one would have to recognize played a pretty big role, because by tolerating these kinds of bars and other organizations and clubs, it made it possible for psychiatrists and physicians and medical doctors to actually study this subculture. They had easier access. And that was one of the advantages for sexologists and psychiatrists in Berlin. They really had something like a laboratory for learning something about sexual minorities. And this never existed in quite the same way in any other major city at this point.
Was there a standout researcher from that time who you think contributed the most to this movement into research into sexual persuasions?
Well, the person that I would name, and the one who comes immediately to mind, is Magnus Hirschfeld. And he was a German Jewish physician. He started a practice in Berlin, I think in 1896. And he also then founded the very first homosexual rights movement just a short time after this. And along with his political activism, he was an incredibly prolific researcher and writer. And so he was really one of the very first sexologists who studied the subculture carefully and tried to describe and tabulate everything that he saw. He was, to some extent, also an inspiration for Kinsey in the United States some 50 years later. There were, of course, though, others. I mean, there was another very prominent Berlin psychiatrist named Albert Moll, and he published the first work that was devoted entirely to this phenomenon of homosexuality already in 1891, and it was also based in large part on his study of the Berlin subculture. He also thanks the Berlin police commissioner, Meerscheid Hulessum, for giving him tours of this subculture. So he also relied on different kinds of police files that were provided for him. So he really had a lot of insider knowledge. But it's this access, this insider knowledge that makes it possible, I think, for this discipline of sexology and sort of allied disciplines like psychiatry to really flourish in a place like Berlin by about 1900.
You said flourishing, which I think is a good way to describe the development of the culture and also research into homosexuality. But then, as we know, the Nazis came to power, and so what happened to Berlin's gay culture and the research into the gay culture in the 30s?
That, of course, is a tragic story, and it wasn't completely clear, in fact, what was going to happen in 1933. What they did immediately was they shut down all of the most infamous or maybe famous bars, the bars that a lot of foreigners and tourists and celebrities might visit, the ones that had tremendous notoriety. But by this point, there were probably 100 or more establishments in Berlin, and the vast majority remained open for another 18 months or almost 2 years into 1935. So it wasn't clear for the first year and a half or 2 years what was really going to happen with this subculture. There's a process called Gleichschaltung or coordination, and every non-Nazi organization after January of 1933 was essentially forced to either join a Nazi organization or simply close down. And that, of course, is what happened with the gay press. The different journals folded pretty much by March of 1933. And then the major gay rights organizations, there were at least three, they were all completely disbanded by the summer of 33. So what the Nazis did then, they immediately destroyed the Sexology Institute of Magnus Hirschfeld. But that was also in part because they had always targeted Hirschfeld as a Jewish sexologist, a Jewish doctor who was studying and sort of bringing perversion to the German folk. That was just a big piece of their anti-Semitism. And it wasn't completely clear, though, if they would really try to completely stamp out this subculture, which was really, really broad, certainly by the early 1930s through the 20s. This happened, though, then in 1935. They introduced an even more draconian anti-gay law, and then they went after practically everyone and anyone. And so at that point, starting in about the middle of 1935, it became incredibly dangerous to have a reputation for being homosexual or gay, and for exhibiting any sort of behavior that might be interpreted that way. So that really became the end. Of course, there was still a subculture. It survived, but it was a really risky thing to have any kind of gay contact at that point.
Well, I think many people are aware of the oppression that gays faced during the Nazi period. It is absolutely fascinating to read about the as you described it, the flourishing of the culture before the Nazis came into power. And so I'd recommend anyone who is interested in finding out more to read Robert Beachy's book Gay Berlin, Birthplace of a Modern Identity, which is being released soon in German as Das andere Berlin, and you can get that on amazon.de. So, Robert Beachy, thank you very much for joining me here on This Week in Germany.
Thank you so much, Daniel. It was great to talk with you.
If you'd like to listen to more interviews just like this one, then head over to our website thisweekingermany.de and click on TWIG Extra. And don't forget to listen to our weekly 30-minute program with the latest news from Germany. That's at that very same website, thisweekingermany.de.